Don't need a band-aid from a bullet hole. Don't need a brand name pharmaceutical. Oh, lend me a hand, stay with me in the cold. Oh, show me the plan, the way back to the beautiful. Don't need an AK or an A-bomb. I need you with me here now. Need you to stay long. All I've got's a melody. All I've got is a song. I can make it if you keep telling me to stand strong. I'm a
addressing the subject of desperation, because I believe it's a subject that's often misconstrued. What is desperation? Now, I'm a father of two boys, and my youngest son, his name is James, he's 1, and my oldest son, his name is Rufino, and he's 3. Now, when James started learning how to walk, we installed a baby gate at the bottom of the steps. Now, in the morning, I would typically go into my son Rufino's room and say to him, hey, let's go downstairs and have breakfast. I would walk down the steps, hop over the gate, and I would go into the kitchen and begin to prepare breakfast for me and my son. Now, after a few minutes of preparing breakfast, I would hear this sort of whimpering or crying coming from the landing of the steps. And it's my son Rufino waiting anxiously to get over the gate and into the living room. And so I would go over there, and the minute he sees me, he would be at peace. He would begin to smile. He'd even begin to laugh. You see, it's not so much about the circumstance that gives my son stress, but more so about the hopelessness, the wondering about whether or not he's going to get out of the situation he doesn't want to be in. Now, I realized this because one morning when I slept in, my wife got up early and she went into my son's room and she said, hey, let's go downstairs and have breakfast. She walks down the steps, she hops over the gate, she goes into the kitchen, and she begins to prepare breakfast for the family. Now, I get up about 10, maybe 15 minutes later. I go out into the hallway and I look down the steps. I notice that my son is sitting there calmly, waiting to get over the gate and into the living room. And I say to him, Rufino, what are you doing? To which he responds, hey, what's up? You see, Rufino realizes that after dealing with our negligence, our forgetfulness for several months, that eventually someone will remember him and get him out of the situation that he doesn't want to be in. Now, I realize this about a lot of his struggles, like when he can't put his shoes on or take his shoes off, or like when he can't reach something that's on a really high shelf, or like when he gets stuck inside his shirt because he's trying to take it off or put it on. The minute he realizes that I'm helping him, he's at peace. He begins to laugh. He even begins to smile. You see, this is what desperation looks like for a 3-year-old. Now, I realize that the circumstances are probably different, and the consequences are probably much more severe. But desperation for adults and young adults alike are not that much different from that of a 3-year-old. You see, desperation isn't so much about the circumstance as it is about the hopelessness, the wondering about whether or not you're going to get out of the situation that you don't want to be in. If someone loses a loved one, they don't find peace in the circumstance. Why? Because the person is gone. That person is not coming back. The situation has changed that person's life forever. They find peace in the idea that maybe one day they'll get to see their loved one again in an afterlife, or that they'll learn to live life without a person they were so dependent on before. That's why they go through things like grief counseling. Same thing with a person who has a debilitating disease. They don't find peace in the circumstance. They find peace in the hope that maybe they'll live a normal life despite that debilitating disease. Or maybe someday they'll have a cure. Or maybe someday the disease will actually take them and they'll be in a better place. They will be without pain. They will be without suffering. That's how they find peace. Now, most of us probably don't experience these extreme situations. But I dare say every single one of us experiences a struggle, a desperation of wondering whether or not we're enough. We seek to answer the question of, am I smart enough? Am I gifted enough? Am I popular enough? Am I achieving enough? Am I attractive enough? And all these thoughts lead to the more prevalent question of, am I significant enough? And when we confront this question, we confront it with great struggle. Am I significant enough to my mother or my father? Am I significant enough to my husband or my wife? Am I significant enough to the children that grew up around me? Am I significant enough to my family members? Am I significant enough to my friends and coworkers? Am I significant enough to the world around me? Am I significant enough to God? Now, people answer these questions with great intensity. As a matter of fact, they put themselves into even much more harsh circumstances so that they might answer these questions a little bit more. For example, I've known people that would starve themselves and tire themselves and physically and painfully alter their bodies just to be a little bit more beautiful. I've known people that would put themselves in life-threatening situations just to be a little bit wealthier. For people like drug dealers or human traffickers or gangbangers. I've known people that would stress their minds and their bodies and neglect their wives and their children just to be a little bit more prestigious, just to move up the ladder in the vocation they've chosen. I believe that anything worth having in life is worth making a sacrifice for. Even though I don't agree with the actions, I do agree with the mentality. God himself made a sacrifice for who he believed was worth it, which was mankind. And being in that very image, we have the mentality to make sacrifices for things that are worth it. But what's tragic to me, what's tragic to God, is when people's actions are inspired by a hope that's always disappointing, a hope that is always fleeting. Because the truth is the world will always demand that you be smarter. The world will always demand that you be more popular. The world will always demand that you be more beautiful. The world will always demand that you be more gifted, that you achieve even greater and greater things throughout your entire life. And when you fail to live up those demands, the world will abandon you. And as time persists, you will eventually fail to live up to those demands. The hope to satisfy the demands of the world is tragically ever chasing, but we keep on chasing because we don't know any other hope. And for those of us who can no longer muster the energy and the motivation to keep on chasing, we turn to things like addiction. We turn to things like self-destruction or self-indulgence or apathy or anything that will fill the void, anything to distract. We medicate. Now, when Jesus came into this world, he came to communicate a message of hope beyond what this world had to offer. And it's a hope that I'm going to desperately try to communicate to you through the book of Matthew. So I speak so elaborately about desperation. Why? Because I believe that when the book of Matthew was written, it was written to a very desperate audience. It was written to Israel during the first century, some decades after Jesus Christ's death. And at that time, Israel was experiencing a state of extreme depression. You see, they had gone centuries and centuries and centuries of relocation, reclamation, and identity crisis. That's because empire after empire kept taking over Israel and forcing its will on the people. Now, some of the empires were actually merciful, but the majority of them were ruthless and even debasing. Now, on a national level, the world considered Israel as a joke. Their education was considered inferior, their customs and practices were considered outdated, and their religion was considered outright foolish. Now, on an individual level, Israel was in conflict with itself. Some had retreated to the mountains to get away from everything and practice a sort of specific kind of Jewish culture. Some had become political collaborators. In other words, they put their political ties before their religious convictions. And some had become religious fanatics. They fought for every aspect of the Jewish law, but the majority of the Israelites, they adopted the popular culture at that time, which is the Greco-Roman culture. It was a very sinful and a very blasphemous and a very godless culture. Now, Matthew, understanding his audience, feels that the people needed to be introduced to a specific kind of kingdom. So what does he do? He introduces them to their proper king. He begins in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Then he goes on to list the entire genealogical record of Jesus Christ, beginning with Abraham, going on to David, going on to the exile, going on to the Christ. Thus, there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile, and 14 from the exile to the Christ. Why are these names so important? Abraham, David, and Jesus Christ. Why does he see fit to mention these names over and over? Well, it's because anybody who is familiar with Jewish culture, anybody who understands Jewish history, understands that the Israelites believed that Abraham was their forefather. In other words, he's the father from whom all their people came about. You know, Abraham had kids, his kids had kids, and thus the entire nation of Israel was born. And they also believed that God himself made a specific covenant with Abraham concerning his people. God says to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you'll be blessed. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now I want to take the last part of that covenant and stick a pin in it for now. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. It's important to understand the type of kingdom that Jesus Christ was trying to build here on earth. Now, God had reestablished that covenant through King David. He says to David, I will establish your throne on earth forever. You see, with Abraham, he wanted to establish a kingdom. And through David, he wanted to establish a specific kind of throne. In other words, a king. And that king was Jesus Christ. Now, he was a different kind of king than the people were used to. And it was a different kind of kingdom than the people were used to seeing. And when the people understood who Jesus Christ was, they had to make a decision about whether or not this is the type of king that they wanted to follow. They had to make a decision about whether or not this is the type of kingdom they wanted to be a part of. It's the very same decision that you have to make when understanding who Jesus Christ really is and the kingdom he's trying to develop. I believe that what is achieved in humanity through obligation or domination is nothing compared to what is achieved in humanity when compelled by inspiration. And hope always seems to be the driving force behind that. You just have to ask yourself, what life do I hope for? You see, this is the type of kingdom that God himself wanted to build on the earth. A kingdom in which its subjects were inspired to live ever-progressing lives. A kingdom in which its people set aside useless aspirations and desires and unshackled itself from compulsion and addiction and sought to refine itself inwardly so that they might be a greater inspiration to others. The Bible says, guard your heart, for it is a wellspring of life. In other words, what you set your heart on will determine how you live your life and how you affect others. So God, he doesn't send a king with power and might to dominate mankind that would defeat the purpose of what he was trying to achieve on earth. If Jesus were to come and dominate man, certainly our actions would be regulated, but our hearts would still be untamed. It's like dictators throughout history. They don't win the loyalty of their subjects. They only win their obedience. As soon as their power is gone, so is their subjects, so are their kingdom. There are authorities like that exist on earth today. They think that by creating and enforcing laws, they can create a moral nation. Now, don't misunderstand me. Laws are very necessary in our world. God himself uses laws in his own teachings. But if those laws aren't accompanied with inspiration, they'll fail to develop good character. For example, growing up in my household, we had rules like don't disobey your parents or don't talk back to your parents. Now, I can follow those rules to a fault. But if I fail to understand the necessity of those laws, if I don't believe in the necessity of those laws, then I'll fail to develop good character. I'll fail to develop the respect of what my parents were for me growing up. We should be compelled to follow God's law because of what we understand about the nature of God and what he is trying to achieve on the earth, and hoping for the very same thing. So it's only fitting that God would send Jesus Christ as his king for his ideal kingdom. Jesus Christ had the power and the authority of the entire universe at his command. It is the power and authority that by far surpasses anything that the world has ever known. Yet what does he do with his power and authority? Does he use it to dominate men? He uses it to compel us. He does things like heal the sick, the lame, the blind, and the mute. He does things like drive demons out of men. He does things like feed thousands of people with only a few loaves of bread. He wilts trees, he calms storms, and for a grand finale, he comes back from the dead. He does this to show men the authority that God has over evil, the presence that God has for people who felt abandoned, the compassion that God has for people who are hurting, the productivity that God is for people who are stagnant, and most importantly, the eternity that God has to offer those who are dying. And he did all of this being a simple human being so that we could follow in his footsteps. Now, you may not have the ability to wilt trees. You may not have the ability to calm storms or feed thousands of people with a few loaves of bread, but you have every opportunity on earth to be compassionate. You have every opportunity on earth to be productive, to be resilient, to be perseverant, to be fearless, to be selfless, to be trustworthy, to be generous, and everything that's incredibly amazing about human beings. God could have chosen a number of people to write this book, but he chose Matthew. Why? Because on the onset, it doesn't make any sense, because Matthew was a thieving extortionist. He was a tax collector. And at that time, tax collectors were thieves. They demanded an exorbitant amount of money from their own struggling people, and they took a large cut for themselves. The Jews didn't want to have anything to do with him. They despised him. As a matter of fact, they lumped him in with the rest of those they considered degenerates. They often use the phrase tax collectors and sinners. Now, it's no surprise to me that Matthew made his company with sinners because, like I said earlier, the Jews didn't want to have anything to do with him. So this message of hope, this gospel message of Jesus Christ, was to be carried out through the Jews and then to the rest of the world. So why trust a man who obviously has no respective influence for his own people, let alone the rest of the world? Now, in order to understand the answer to that question, you have to understand Jesus Christ's purpose on earth. You have to understand a little bit more about the type of king that he is. So the book of Matthew continues with Jesus Christ's birth. It says this. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child through the Holy Spirit. Now, because Joseph was a righteous man and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. After he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, for what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins." You are to give him the name Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife. But he had no union with her until she gave birth to a son, and they gave him the name Jesus. Now, in this passage, Matthew makes it evidently clear that Jesus Christ was sent on earth to do one thing, and that's to save his people from their sins. He makes it evidently clear through the divine name that was given to him, Jesus, which means God saves, and the way in which he was born, the virgin birth. Now, the virgin birth is a deeper theology that I'll get into later on in this series, but for right now, just understand that Jesus Christ was sent on earth to save people from their sins. Now, Matthew also makes it evident that Jesus Christ was sent to earth to be one thing, and that is the full representation of God to the world. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Jesus Christ spent his entire life doing and being those two things. So when Jesus approaches Matthew, he finds him at a tax collector's booth, and he says to him, "Follow me." Matthew gets up and follows him. Jesus finds Matthew in the midst of his own sin, his own greedy self-indulgence, but instead of condemning him, he offers him the opportunity to walk with God. And Matthew, without hesitation, with what seems to be no reservations at all, gets up and follows him. Now, I can't claim to know what Matthew was thinking or feeling at the time, but what I can tell you is that Matthew's life prior to his encounter with Jesus Christ was not something he felt was worth holding on to. His everyday chasing after wealth was something he was willing to set aside for the opportunity to walk with Jesus Christ, for what he believed about who this guy was. Now, Jesus Christ talks about this kingdom in very much the same way. He says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field. When a man found it, he went and hid it again. Then in all his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field." He says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant searching for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold all he had and bought it." Now, this was no temporary thing for Matthew. He eventually died for what he believed about Jesus Christ, and his legacy is this book, the book of Matthew. It's been in circulation for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, doing nothing but advocating the greatness of Jesus Christ and the hope that he has to offer the world around him. Now, I use Matthew's story because I want you to understand who the subjects of the kingdom are. The citizens of God's kingdom are those who understand their life of sin, acknowledge their life of sin, and desire to escape it. They want to escape it through the guidance, the teachings, the intervention of God. In other words, a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And Matthew, of all people, would have understood this very well. Take a personal evaluation of who you are and what you're doing with your life, and ask yourself, what do I want my life to be? Do I desire creature comforts, or do I desire greater character? Do I desire a higher standard of living or a higher state of being? Do I want to take all I can from this world, consuming everything, or do I want to make something that's actually usable for somebody in this world? Do I want to live for what is temporary, or do I want to live for what is eternal? We can either choose to live within the restrictions of our creature comforts, compulsions, and desires, or we can condition ourselves daily for the opportunities that come from a truly freed mind and heart. Now, it's important for me to tell you with warning that the circumstances or the conditions for the Israelites who had accepted Jesus Christ didn't always get better. For a season, things were incredible for them, but eventually they became horrifically worse. A life with Jesus Christ doesn't exclude you from hardship, doesn't exclude you from sadness and pain and suffering. But what continued to happen within these Israelites is they became refined in both their hearts and in their minds, resilient in the cause of loving mankind, even in the face of their own death. Nothing that the world could throw at them could keep them from doing what God had compelled them to do. And what happened was they became this great inspiration for generations beyond themselves. the same inspiration that compelled people like Bach to compose music, compelled people like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis to write books, compelled the revolutionary minds of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., compelled the undying compassion of the amazing Mother Teresa. The same inspiration of Jesus Christ motivated landmark institutions that you know of today, like Compassion International, World Vision, Salvation Army. These institutions cater to the physical, educational, and spiritual needs of millions upon millions of people daily, all over the world. All of this to fulfill the covenant that God had made through Abraham. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. This is the kingdom that God desired for mankind. This is the kingdom that God built on the earth. And it's a very different kingdom than anything that we've ever known. Jesus Christ is a very different king than anyone that we've ever known. You know, it puzzles me to understand why people won't even consider what Jesus Christ has to say. Think about this for a minute. What do people do to gain wealth or fame or power? What do? They invent, they create, they sell, they negotiate, they perform, entertain, they manipulate or dominate or do a number of other things, moral or otherwise. Jesus Christ had the opportunity to gain unimaginable riches with his ability to heal alone, not to mention his teachings and his influence. But what does he do with this opportunity? Does he live in castles and mansions? Does he travel in luxury with a procession of servants catering to his every comforts? No, he does exactly the opposite. He was born in a borrowed room, slept mainly on borrowed beds, and traveled mainly by foot. Hundreds upon hundreds of people watched him marching into Jerusalem on a donkey. Not even a great donkey, the foal of a donkey, in other words, a small donkey. Now, it's not my place. I'm not here to judge the living conditions of the rich and the powerful. I don't know their hearts. I'm not here to condemn them. But Jesus Christ, as a king, has no reason to be accused of any kind of greed or self-entitlement. He has no reason to be accused of any kind of vanity or narcissism. He is a king that lived his life above reproach without any excuse for distrust. So many people are willing to trust and adopt the ideas and philosophies of charismatic millionaires over the words of Jesus Christ. I can think of two reasons why. One, the life and the motivation that Jesus Christ has to offer, the hope that he desires to bring to the world, is not something that you want. Or two, you don't know who Jesus Christ is in intimate detail, and you don't know the kingdom that he's trying to build on earth. It's my ambition. It's my God-inspired motivation to help you with the latter.